The content in this program is not medical advice. Viewers should consult their doctor for all health concerns.
In the past century, the world has faced 4 influenza pandemics. The most recent was swine flu in 2009.
Normally results in high level of disease and also rapid spread throughout the population.
Around 2,000 Australians die each year from the flu. During a pandemic, the potential death toll is far higher. Antiviral drugs were thought to be an effective weapon against influenza. But it now turns out this was based on incomplete evidence.
There's a problem here. Data being collected, patients take part in a trial, and their data never published. And that's a disgrace. That can't be allowed to continue.
Nonetheless, governments around the world have spent millions of dollars stockpiling these medications in preparation for a pandemic. So, in light of new evidence, experts are now asking, are these drugs effective and is it money well spent? Influenza is a highly contagious virus spread through aerosols. Once the virus enters the respiratory tract, it hijacks the tissue cells and manufactures thousands of clones. Virologist Erin Hurt heads a lab that monitors the emergence of flu pandemics. He says vaccines are effective during the regular flu season, but if a pandemic strikes, a vaccine is unlikely to protect you.
The thing about a pandemic is it's a new, novel influenza strain. It does take time to prepare a vaccine. But that may be 4, 5, 6 months down the track after that's started. So our other tool that we have to try and combat influenza are the antiviral drugs.
Until recently, antiviral medications were largely ineffective. But in the late 90s, new antivirals hit the market. Relenza, an inhalable powder, and Tamiflu, a pill. Both belong to a class of drugs called neuraminidase inhibitors.
So what we're looking at is a structural representation of what the neuraminidase looks like. On the surface of the virus, these neuraminidase spikes come out. And in the middle here is where the drug binds into that active site of the neuraminidase in a sort of lock and key type mechanism.
So that binding essentially disables the virus?
It does. The main role of the neuraminidase is to release the virus from the host cell so it can go on and infect more cells. What the drug does is stops that ability of that virus to release.
Like the flu.
In America, persuasive ads like this use humour to market these medications to everyone over the age of 1.
Tamiflu attacks the flu virus at its source, so don't wait. Call your doctor right away.
Early on, the consensus was these medications could stop the spread of influenza and reduce the number of hospitalisations and complications.
So ask your doctor about Tamiflu.
Since 2002, the Australian government has spent $380 million stockpiling these medications, stored in warehouses like this, ready to deploy in the event of a pandemic. The stockpile also contains vaccines and protective equipment for barrier control.
The stockpile is a part of the pandemic plan to specifically treat severely ill patients. In other situations, you might imagine that they may be used as a prophylaxis for healthcare workers to ensure that our healthcare workers can remain at work, and others may be prophylaxis for those at severe risk of complications, those with asthma, diabetes, underlying heart conditions, these sort of things.
Infectious diseases expert Professor Peter Collignon says many believed that antivirals would prove to be as revolutionary as antibiotics.
When Tamiflu first became available, it looked like it was great. I mean, I took the view that, hey, this is like a new antibiotic equivalent. We've got a bacterial infection, we can kill it with an antibiotic. Here is a virus we have not been able to kill, and we can kill it. You saw all the preliminary data, the journals, and I guess the publicity from the drug as well. It all looked, hey, this is great.
In 2009, when swine flu spread globally, Tamiflu sales grew sharply to around $4 billion. But now, some experts are questioning the drug's safety and effectiveness.
The reality is more data has become available. It doesn't appear to be working anywhere near as well as my expectation was, and I think a lot of people's expectation.
New data recently emerged because of the determined efforts of a tenacious and prestigious group of researchers called the Cochrane Collaboration.
It's got no links with industry or government or anyone else. It's designed there just to help clinicians and their patients independently.
Professor Chris Del Mar is one of the Cochrane reviewers. His group had the unenviable task of sifting through vast amounts of literature on antiviral drugs, prompted by the surge in their use during the swine flu pandemic.
When we did the initial analysis, it was straightforward. We just looked at published data. It showed that the drug reduces complications and the drug also reduces symptoms. Easy. We then got some criticism that we had only hadn't looked at all of the data properly, and there was some data missing and not published. When we looked carefully at the data, we became anxious that there might have been some cherry picking of the trials that had been published and the ones that hadn't been published. And we wondered about how many trials had never been published. Big breath in and out.
Cochrane then asked Roche for access to all its unpublished Tamiflu data. But the company resisted. This Roche-recorded interview posted online explains why.
At the time that we were approached to provide the clinical data, this was unprecedented to the industry. And at the time we were uncertain as to whether or not in fact this was legal or whether or not we'd actually be breaching patient confidentiality.
The Cochrane Collaboration enlisted the help of Dr. Fiona Godley, editor-in-chief of the British Medical Journal. Together, they led a very public campaign aimed at pressuring Roche into giving them full access to unpublished data on Tamiflu.
This was a bit iconic. The drug itself was a public health drug. It was being bought in large amounts, spending billions of dollars around the world. I think we felt that was one reason why this drug was worth pursuing.
Dr. Godley took her concerns about the undisclosed Tamiflu data all the way to the UK Parliamentary Accounts Committee.
There are not only 15 trials of Tamiflu, but 123 trials of Tamiflu, of which 74 are entirely Roche-funded, Roche-controlled. Roche has the data. That you begin to see the madness of the situation, that we are getting a very, very partial, incomplete, misleading picture of the effectiveness of many drugs.
Roche says at the time it was not standard practice to publish all data, and it considered the publicly available Tamiflu studies accurately reflected the benefits of the drug.
I think it's very hard to explain why this behaviour by the pharmaceutical industry in suppressing data over many years is not considered as misconduct. As many people would say, in a scientific experiment, if you suppress data, that's considered misconduct. We should be pushing back and saying this is unacceptable. This is not justified by commercial interest. This is about patients' health, public health, and we absolutely have to have all the trial data of trials that are performed on members of the public.
After 4 years, Roche finally released all its information. It turned out the majority of data had never been disclosed. Cochrane then took on the mammoth task of analysing the unpublished results. In April last year, it released the new findings.
It does help control symptoms by about a bit less than a day. It reduces the time to full recovery. The big thing that we did find was that it didn't help the complications, the hospitalizations, any of the complications that we were particularly interested in and are particularly important for this drug. It's one of the reasons for having it. Didn't seem to work.
In fact, Cochrane equated antivirals to simple pain relievers, but 10 times more costly.
It could be that this drug is really just a kind of expensive aspirin. It just, makes you feel better, but you carry on excreting virus. If that's true, then this is a public health disaster because people will feel better when they've got influenza and go wandering around, going shopping and going to football matches and spread the virus. That's going to be counter to what we want people to do, which is to stay home, don't spread the virus.
Another concern arising from the new Cochrane analysis was that the side effects had been underestimated.
Well, we knew that the drug causes nausea, and we were able to document how much nausea there is, quite a lot. There's an increase in the amount of neuropsychiatric side effects. Now, these are probably more serious.
But they're still very rare, aren't they?
Yeah, pretty rare. Rare events, yeah. But, more than had been documented previously.
Undoubtedly, all drugs have side effects. Doctors often weigh up the risks versus the benefits before prescribing a drug. Now, this latest Cochrane analysis has some doctors re-evaluating their view on these medications.
First of all, the benefits were nowhere near as big as I had and others had perceived before. It came from there down to there. And the side effects seemed to be more common than was appreciated as well, so they came up. So the overall balance started becoming more marginal. So I guess, if you like, I've been a bit disappointed that I had this great expectation we'd have an antiviral drug that would be as good as an antibiotic, but that doesn't seem to be the reality. Where it actually is now, I'm not sure.
The Cochrane report has not gone unchallenged. A new study looking at similar data came to a different conclusion. It reported Tamiflu not only reduced symptoms, but also complications and hospitalisations. In response, Cochrane reviewers cautioned the study was indirectly funded by Roche and co-authored by a board member for the company that holds the patent on Tamiflu. These factors, Cochrane says, could influence the findings. But Roche insists it had no role in the study's analysis or interpretation, and its position on Tamiflu remains unchanged.
The information which we've used to understand the safety and efficacy of Tamiflu has come from more than 11,000 patients in clinical trials, but also from more than 130 million people who around the world, by their doctor, have been prescribed Tamiflu. Roche welcomes Cochrane's analysis and their view on the data. However, the view that they've taken on the data is very different from that taken by regulators all around the world and by Roche.
Well, that's actually not true. The FDA in America do not claim that Tamiflu reduces the complications of influenza. But elsewhere in the world, they say it does.
In a statement, the FDA said, Tamiflu has not been proven to have a positive impact on hospitalisations, mortality, or economic impact of seasonal, avian, or pandemic influenza.
Now, it's not clear why Australia's drug regulator, the TGA, differs from America's equivalent, the FDA, when it comes to claims about Tamiflu.
It may just come down to money. The FDA is better equipped to handle vast amounts of data, given it's the best resourced drug regulator in the world. One thing's for sure, it reinforces the need for impartial researchers like the Cochrane collaboration, who can perform complex yet independent analyses on drug trials.
It would be great to rely on the regulators, but as things are, they are chronically underfunded, overstretched. And I think what we need is a system where there's a much wider potential for scrutiny, so people from different approaches can look at these data and come to a view, and then we can have a properly informed debate about whether these drugs are effective or not.
We need to change how our regulators are funded. Both the FDA and the TGA have got a user pays model, but I think the problem is the money goes straight to the regulator, which means if they discourage a drug from being used, they run the risk that their income drops.
Funding for the TGA comes exclusively from industry. This raises concerns that the TGA could be pressured into putting the needs of industry before public safety. The TGA strongly denies this and says it usually seeks the advice of an independent expert advisory committee before making a decision to approve or reject a new product. So will the government continue to stockpile antivirals in the face of such uncertainty? A statement from the Department of Health said, based on all available data, including the most recent Cochrane report, the Australian government will continue to maintain its stockpile of the antiviral drugs. The PRIDE study is often cited as evidence for using antivirals during a pandemic. Funded by Roche, it assessed 29,000 patients who'd been hospitalised with swine flu in 2009.
they found that those who received the neuraminidase inhibitor had a 25% reduction in the likelihood of death. Also importantly is in those individuals that were treated within 2 days, 48 hours of symptom onset, that reduction in the likelihood of death reduced to 50%.
To use observational data, particularly of such poor quality as this, is not a good way to answer a question of whether a drug works or not.
In fact, many of the claims about the effectiveness of antivirals during a pandemic are based largely on observational data.
In science, the most reliable evidence comes from randomised controlled trials. They're the gold standard. But they've never been done during a pandemic, so we can't say for certain these drugs reduce death in high-risk patients. So why don't we do randomised controlled trials on high-risk patients, the ones we think will benefit the most?
It becomes really an ethical issue, and this is because standard of care is treatment with a neuraminidase inhibitor. Now, a randomised control trial involves treatment with either the active drug or a placebo or a sugar pill. Now, it's unethical to be given someone who's severely ill a sugar pill as part of this trial.
The decision that it wouldn't be ethical to run a trial during a pandemic is an interesting one. Effectively, what you've got is trust in a drug has been created based on biased, selected information. And as a result of that so-called trust in the drug, we suddenly find ourselves unable to test it in the real situation against placebo. And that is a false faith in the drug that is preventing us from getting really good evidence about whether this drug works or not.
I personally think that we would be better to spend our resources in masks and gloves than in taking a tablet which isn't that effective. And we know that the masks and gloves and soap and water, you know, all that ordinary stuff, is extremely effective at reducing the transmission of virus. And I think we should be spending much more on that than this pill.
Do you think the pros outweigh the cons when it comes to prescribing Tamiflu for seasonal influenza?
I personally do not. I don't. And if I ever get influenza, I won't take it. Myself or my family.
Certainly, if it was my loved one who was in a bed, particularly unwell, in hospital, infected with influenza, I would be very strongly encouraging the clinician to prescribe an antiviral.
Personally, myself, if I got influenza, I wouldn't take it. I think the benefits are marginal versus the side effects. And for me, who is otherwise healthy, I don't think it's worth me taking it.
The controversy over the disclosure of clinical trial data is not exclusive to Tamiflu. It's a problem across a broad range of medicines.
Drug companies are anxious about wanting to make their drugs look good. That's quite understandable. They need to make a profit for their shareholders. So I think they feel that for their interest, it's much better that they present the positive information and suppress the negative information.
I think what it shows is we need data. If millions or billions of people are potentially taking a drug or a vaccine, that data needs to be transparent, open. It is unacceptable to have data locked up, commercial in confidence, that says that people have side effects but the community and people don't know about it.
The BMJ and Cochrane collaboration are part of a global campaign called alltrials.net. Its aim is to mitigate data suppression. It requires drug companies to register clinical trials and encourages full transparency of the results.
We now have a real sense that public and patient groups are beginning to understand that the current situation is not okay, that decisions being made on their behalf, decisions being made by them, are not fully informed by all of the information. And I think that has been a real shift.
There's little doubt we need better antivirals for influenza. Fortunately, researchers are already developing new ways of attacking the virus.
It's a very serious disease, even on a seasonal basis, and then, of course, in a pandemic situation, becomes very serious. There are a vast number of different antivirals that are coming through phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials. And so in the next 5 or so years, we may see some of those drugs coming to market, and then we've got other options to treat individuals.
With Roche paving the way by handing over all their trial data, the hope is that other drug companies follow their lead. For more information and extended interviews, you can go to our website.
The content in this program is not medical advice. Viewers should consult their doctor for all health concerns.